So I'm just going to speak briefly to Chapter 4 and then give some direction for your portfolio entry 2. Chapter 4 also invites us to think closely with how language matters, that it's, again, not only communicative, but that language provokes a certain response and invites us to compose meaning in certain ways, that words matter. On page 43, Stengers writes, "To name is not to say what is true, but to confer on what is named the power to make us feel and think in the mode that that name calls for." So I invite you this week to stay with this attention to language and what certain words make possible. As Stengers writes, we might resist the temptation to reduce what makes for an event, what calls us into question, to a simple problem, but rather to make the difference between the question that's imposed and the response to create something into existence. So how might language then help us to create these spaces where we might respond differently? This chapter, I think, on the intrusion of Gaia very much helps us think about the kinds of conditions and ways of thinking that might be necessary to respond differently. Stengers writes that combating global heating is not effective because it reduces a focus on Gaia's response as an anecdote to her ticklish assemblage and temperament that are, quote, indifferent to our reasons and our projects. So Gaia is then deaf to our justifications. So in thinking about this intrusion of Gaia, it's also important to think about who faces this barbarism most acutely. Surely the precarity of our times is more deeply felt by some than others, and not only humans for that matter. And then technological solutions that are situated within the premise and the promise of science and technology perhaps veil these social and oppressive hierarchies that distribute the felt values of climate catastrophe. So who feels these effects and who has the privilege to ignore them? So in this way, Gaia doesn't reason in social justice, as Stengers says in this chapter. So then, if Gaia is unreasonable, we cannot act against her response. That would be an impossible feat. We must then act against what has provoked her. So the kinds of thinking and actions that tickle her in the first place, that annoy and disturb her, and that Stengers writes that this is a very different response that's not necessarily situated in the logic of a solution or an antidote, but that this is not a remedy to her irrational behaviors or the symptomatic effects of her disturbance, but rather Stengers proposes that our responses have to interrogate the ways of knowing and the authorities that give power to the grand narratives of progress and human emancipation that separate us from our entanglement with this ticklish assemblage. So on page 50, Stengers writes that naming Gaia is naming a question. And this week, I hope we can stay skeptical of the answers, stay skeptical of answers to the questions that Gaia puts forth. On page 50, Stengers writes, "The response doesn't belong to us. That is, those who have both provoked her intrusion and now decipher it through data, models, and simulations. Naming Gaia is naming a question, but emphatically not defining the terms of the answer." This is central, I think. As such, a definition would give us again, always us, the first and the last word. Here she's highlighting the position of the human in this sort of epistemology that we were discussing last week of scientific reason. Learning to compose will need many names, not a global one. The voices of many peoples, knowledges, and earthly practices. It belongs to a process of multifold creation, the terrible difficulty of which it would be foolish and dangerous to underestimate, but which it would be suicidal to think of as impossible. And this is what I find hopeful about Stengers' writing. There will be no response other than the barbaric if we do not learn to couple together multiple, divergent struggles and engagements in this process of creation, as hesitant and as stammering as it may be. So I'm going to shift gears and move to your portfolio entry 2, which is about composing vocabularies. So this week's portfolio entry is an exercise in paying attention and experimenting with language and poetics. So I'm inviting you to consider how language might create and characterize worlds that could exist outside of capitalist thought, and thinking about what kinds of vocabularies might be needed to create new knowledges in the midst of advanced capitalism, in the thick of the mess that we're living, but without giving to this knowledge the power of a definition. And this is the tricky part that Stengers speaks to so well. So this week we'll be creating a glossary page on your Wix site that includes 3 words from a list that I'll provide for you. So following Stengers, your glossary should resist the temptation to reduce meaning into simplicity and aim to enhance the complexity of the meaning that you're making from the text. So for each word that you choose from the list, write a short response that creatively illuminates 3 things. A response or affect that this word evokes for you, what this word does to your relation with Gaia, as Stengers describes her in chapter 4, and how the meaning of this word might be imagined with and in capitalist times. So the word list will be provided, and I invite you to be playful, poetic, use metaphor, and try to think beyond the literal in this entry, and use this as an opportunity to experiment with meaning in playful ways and language. So again, if you have any questions or are feeling concerned about anything, concept or a portfolio entry, please do feel free to email me, and I'm happy to chat with you. Thanks everyone. Have a great week.